Have you ever had the feeling that something invisible is determining your choices without you noticing? That strange sensation that even when you believe you're making a completely personal and free decision, forces you cannot control have already defined the path you will follow? I'm not talking about conspiracy theories about mind control or direct manipulation, but about something much more subtle and deep that is redefining what it means to be an individual in the contemporary world. Think about the last product you bought online or the last political opinion you formed. How truly yours was that choice? The uncomfortable truth that few are willing to face is that the concept of individuality we inherited from the last centuries is dissolving rapidly before our eyes, replaced by a new reality we still struggle to fully understand. For millennia, human beings lived in communities where the individual was secondary to the group. The idea that each person is a separate, unique entity with inalienable rights and a voice that deserves to be heard is extremely recent in human history. It was only in the last few centuries that we developed this narrative of the autonomous individual capable of making independent choices based on a stable inner core we call identity. The Enlightenment and later Romanticism celebrated this idea. Market capitalism turned it into fuel for consumption, and liberal democracies enshrined it in their constitutions and bills of rights. Thus was born the modern myth of the sovereign individual, the one who, regardless of external circumstances, possesses an authentic inner self and an inalienable freedom to make choices that express that self. This narrative became so fundamental to our civilization that we rarely question it. We built our lives, economies, political systems, and moral values around it. But what happens when we discover that this sovereign individual may never have existed the way we imagined? And even more disturbing, what happens when technology exposes the cracks in this illusion, showing that we are far more influenceable, predictable, and interconnected than our favorite myth suggests? Evidence is starting to pile up alarmingly. Modern neuroscience has already shown that many of the decisions we attribute to our conscious will are actually taken by unconscious brain processes seconds before we have the subjective feeling of deciding. Cognitive psychology has cataloged hundreds of biases that systematically distort our perceptions and choices, often without us having any awareness of it. Behavioral genetics suggests that characteristics we consider deeply personal, from musical preferences to political tendencies, have significant hereditary components. Social sciences show how our behaviors and beliefs are shaped by structural factors far beyond our individual control. But perhaps nothing has exposed the fragility of the autonomous individual as clearly as the digital revolution of recent decades. The algorithms that power our social networks and digital platforms can now predict our behaviors with unsettling precision. Studies show that with just a few dozen likes, an algorithm can predict your political preferences, sexual orientation, personality traits, and emotional vulnerabilities more accurately than your close friends. With a few hundred interactions, these systems can know aspects of your behavior that even you do not consciously perceive. And this raises a deeply uncomfortable question for our self-understanding as individuals. If an algorithm can predict what I will do better than I can, what does that say about my supposed autonomy? If my emotional reactions, desires, and even my deepest opinions can be mapped, predicted, and eventually manipulated by increasingly sophisticated systems, what remains of the sovereign individual celebrated by liberal humanism? Here we are not talking only about targeted advertising or product recommendations. We are witnessing the emergence of an unprecedented ability to shape human behavior on a massive scale. Digital platforms are not just neutral tools we use, but carefully designed environments that shape our attention, emotions, and behaviors in fundamental ways. When you spend hours endlessly scrolling your screen, it is not because you made a free and conscious choice, but because extremely skilled behavioral engineers designed systems that exploit the vulnerabilities of your brain to keep you engaged. The attention economy is based precisely on the ability to capture and direct your mental focus, turning your consciousness into a resource to be mined and sold. Even when we believe we are expressing our most authentic thoughts on social networks, we are actually participating in a complex system that shapes those expressions according to engagement metrics and amplification algorithms that favor certain types of emotional content. Outrage, anger, and polarization are not accidents in this system, but predictable consequences of its architecture. All of this forces us to deeply reconsider what it means to be an individual in the digital age. The traditional image of the self as a stable, coherent, and autonomous entity is being challenged not only by scientific discoveries, but by the very daily experience of existing in digital environments that fragment our attention and modularize our identity. Perhaps today it is more accurate to think of the individual not as a singular and sovereign entity, but as a nexus of influences, a temporary point of convergence in a complex network of biological, technological, economic, and social forces. This view is not necessarily pessimistic. Recognizing the limits of traditional individuality can free us from unrealistic expectations and help us develop a more accurate understanding of how we really function. But it also raises urgent questions about how to preserve values we associate with the individual, such as dignity, moral responsibility, and meaningful freedom, in a world that increasingly reveals the contingent and interconnected nature of our existence. To better understand this transformation, we need to step back and examine how we got here. For most of human history, people did not primarily see themselves as autonomous individuals in the modern sense. In tribal hunter-gatherer societies, identity was intrinsically tied to the group. In ancient agricultural civilizations, it was defined by social position, family lineage, and role in the broader cosmic order. Even in medieval Europe, the person was understood mainly through relationships and obligations within a community, guild, or religious order. The idea of the individual as the fundamental unit of society and bearer of inalienable rights began to emerge more clearly during the European Renaissance, gained philosophical force with the Enlightenment, and crystallized politically with the American and French revolutions. Thinkers like Locke, Kant, and Mill articulated visions of the human being as naturally free and rational, capable of self-determination. This conception of individuality soon intertwined with nascent capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, which began to dissolve traditional social structures and create societies based on contracts, markets, and mobility. During the 19th and 20th centuries, this notion of individuality deepened and spread globally, supporting everything from mass consumerism to civil rights movements. The idea that each person has an authentic inner self that deserves expression and recognition became practically a dogma in contemporary culture. However, even as we celebrated the individual, powerful forces were already in motion that would eventually challenge that conception. Mass production and modern advertising began to create standardized consumers. Government and corporate bureaucracies treated people as interchangeable units. And the rise of modern psychology began to reveal how deeply we are influenced by unconscious forces. The digital revolution has drastically accelerated these trends. When we enter social networks, we do not simply find a neutral space for individual expression. We enter environments meticulously designed to shape behaviors, extract data, and generate engagement. Every like, share, comment, and even the time we spend watching certain content feeds systems that build increasingly precise models of who we are, how we react, and what we will likely do next. We are witnessing the emergence of what some call surveillance capitalism, where the target is not only our money or time, but our very subjective experience transformed into behavioral data that can be analyzed, sold, and used to shape future behaviors. At an unprecedented level, our seemingly personal choices are being influenced by systems designed to maximize not our well-being or autonomy, but commercial metrics such as screen time, clicks, and conversions. What makes this situation even more complex is the fact that we are not passive victims. We actively participate in this system, often enthusiastically. We voluntarily upload intimate details of our lives, express our opinions and emotions, and entrust growing aspects of our existence to digital platforms. We are in a symbiotic relationship with technology, where it simultaneously amplifies some of our capabilities while subtly reshaping who we are. This transformation raises profound questions about autonomy and authenticity. When a recommendation algorithm suggests a book that I end up loving, is that experience less authentic because it was partially orchestrated by an automated system? When my political indignation is amplified by a news feed designed to maximize emotional engagement, are those emotions less genuine? The answer is not simple. We are entering a territory where the lines between personal choice and external influence, between authenticity and manipulation, between the self and the system, are becoming fundamentally blurred. Artificial intelligence adds another layer to this complexity. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they not only track and influence our behavior, but begin to perform functions traditionally associated with human agency. Algorithms now write texts, create art, compose music, diagnose diseases, and make decisions that affect our lives in countless ways. In some domains, they already consistently surpass human capabilities. This not only challenges our sense of human exceptionalism, but also raises questions about what truly constitutes thought, creativity, and understanding. If an AI system can write moving poetry, solve complex problems, and hold meaningful conversations, what does that tell us about those activities we once considered exclusively human? What do consciousness and subjectivity mean in a world where increasingly sophisticated behaviors can emerge from systems without those qualities as we understand them? Philosopher Daniel Dennett suggests that perhaps we should see the human mind not as a single unified entity, but as a collection of multiple processes and subsystems working in parallel, something like a society of minds within the brain. In this view, the feeling of being a unified, coherent self is partly a useful illusion, a simplification our brains create to navigate a complex world. If this is correct, our individuality was already much less solid and more distributed than we tend to imagine even before the digital age. Contemporary technological environments only make this reality more evident and amplify its scale. They force us to confront the fact that the individual, as conceived by liberal humanism, with its stable core and sovereign will, may be more a specific cultural construction than a universal truth about the human condition. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this dissolution of self-boundaries in the digital world most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about this too? I know that many of us keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about the transformation of individuality is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. A critical point to consider is that this transformation does not affect everyone equally. Access to digital technologies, exposure to algorithmic surveillance, and the ability to exercise some control over one's digital presence vary enormously depending on factors such as geography, social class, education, and privilege. In some parts of the world, people struggle to obtain basic internet access, while in others, privileged individuals can hire services to manage and protect their online identity. There is a variable geometry of power and vulnerability in the digital world, where some have more capacity than others to maintain some semblance of traditional individuality. Furthermore, the very technologies that challenge our notion of individuality were developed in specific cultural contexts, mainly in Silicon Valley, and they embody particular values and assumptions. The emphasis on data collection, personalization, and engagement is not an inevitable outcome of technology, but reflects specific choices about how to design digital systems, often driven by commercial imperatives. In other words, the way individuality is being transformed is not a natural or inevitable process, but the product of human decisions, economic systems, and power structures. This suggests that we could, in principle, make different choices about how to develop and regulate digital technologies. Some societies are already taking different paths. The European Union, for example, has implemented regulations such as the GDPR, aimed at giving individuals more control over their personal data, establishing a different model of relationship between people and digital platforms. China and Russia, on the other hand, are building digital ecosystems where the state has a central role in mediating online identity. We are in a formative moment where multiple visions of the digital future compete with one another. The question is not simply whether the traditional notion of individuality will survive, but what new concepts of personhood, identity, and autonomy are emerging, and which values they will embody. Historically, major technological transformations have been accompanied by deep changes in how human beings understand themselves. The invention of writing, the printing press, the mechanical clock, the Industrial Revolution, all fundamentally altered people's relationship with themselves and with the world. Each of these transitions was accompanied by anxiety, resistance, and eventually adaptation, with new cultural and philosophical forms emerging to make sense of the transformed reality. Plato, for example, expressed concern that writing would weaken human memory and produce only a semblance of wisdom. In a way, he was right. Writing fundamentally changed how we store and process knowledge, but it also opened possibilities unimaginable in a purely oral culture. Similarly, the digital revolution is forcing us to re-examine basic assumptions about who we are. The self-sufficient, autonomous, unified individual we inherited from liberal humanism is being challenged by a reality in which we are increasingly understood and understand ourselves as nodes in complex networks of relationships, influences, and interconnections. Our minds extend into devices and systems beyond our skulls. Our identities are distributed across multiple platforms and contexts. Our choices are shaped by algorithmic forces we barely begin to understand. It is natural to feel anxiety in the face of this transformation. The model of individuality being challenged is not just an abstract theory, but the foundation of how we organize our lives, societies, and systems of value. Concepts like moral responsibility, human dignity, political freedom, and artistic expression are all deeply intertwined with the notion that we are, in some fundamental sense, self-contained individuals with the capacity to make autonomous choices. What happens to these values in a world where the boundary between self and system becomes increasingly porous? For example, our legal systems are built upon the notion of individual responsibility. We presume that people are autonomous agents responsible for their actions. But how can we assign responsibility in an environment where behavior is increasingly influenced or even determined by algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement or profit? If a person is radicalized by a recommendation algorithm designed to maximize their screen time, who is morally responsible for the consequences? Similarly, our conceptions of privacy presume a clear distinction between public and private, between information that belongs to the individual and that which is legitimately accessible to others. But in a world of ubiquitous surveillance and massive data analysis, where even our typing patterns or eye movements can reveal intimate information about our mental health or sexual orientation, what remains of privacy as traditionally conceived? Perhaps more deeply, our understanding of meaning and purpose is often tied to the idea that we are authors of our own lives, able to define our values, set goals, and pursue our own path. But what happens to this narrative when our seemingly most personal choices are increasingly mediated, influenced, and even determined by algorithmic systems? How can we find meaning in a world where the very notion of authentic choice becomes problematic? These are not merely theoretical questions. They reflect dilemmas we already face in our everyday lives. When we spend hours absorbed in our screens, often against our best intentions, are we exercising freedom or being manipulated? When our news feeds present us a view of reality algorithmically customized to maximize our emotional engagement, are we really forming autonomous opinions about the world? When our social interactions are increasingly mediated by platforms designed to capture and monetize our attention, what happens to the authenticity of our connections? There are no simple answers to these questions. We are navigating unexplored territory, trying to develop new conceptual models for a rapidly transforming reality, but some promising directions are emerging. First, we may need to develop a more relational and less atomistic understanding of identity. Instead of thinking of the self as an isolated and self-contained entity, we can recognize that we have always been fundamentally defined by our relationships, contexts, and connections. The philosopher Charles Taylor argues that the self always exists within what he calls webs of interlocution. The social, linguistic, and cultural contexts that make identity possible. In this view, the erosion of the autonomous individual is not necessarily a loss, but an opportunity to rediscover something that has always been true, that we are constitutively social and interconnected beings. Second, we may need to re-evaluate our notions of agency and freedom. Instead of defining freedom as the absence of external influence, which becomes increasingly unsustainable in an algorithmic world, we can think of it in terms of our ability to critically reflect on the influences that shape us, to understand how the systems we inhabit are affecting us, and to consciously participate in the formation of these systems. Freedom in this sense is not the absence of external determination, but the capacity for critical engagement and conscious participation in our own formation. Third, we may need to develop a technological design ethic more centered on human flourishing. Instead of accepting the current paradigm where technologies are designed primarily to maximize engagement, data extraction, and profit, we can work to create digital environments that genuinely expand our capabilities, respect our autonomy, and promote fundamental human values. This requires not only appropriate regulation, but a profound re-evaluation of the purpose of technology in our lives. Finally, we may need to recover forms of experience and connection that exist outside the digital domain. As more aspects of our lives are mediated by screens and algorithms, direct contact with other human beings, with nature, and with our own unmediated bodily and mental processes may gain new importance and meaning. These may become spaces where different forms of individuality and connection can flourish, not in opposition to the digital world, but as a necessary counterpoint to it. The challenge before us is not simply to resist the dissolution of the traditional individual, which may be largely futile, nor to completely abandon the values associated with it, which would be potentially catastrophic. Instead, we need to reimagine what it means to be a person in a world where the boundaries between self and system, between personal choice and algorithmic influence, between human identity and technological processes, are becoming fundamentally blurred. This is not merely theoretical work. It is a practical and urgent task we all face as we try to navigate our daily lives in a radically transformed environment. How can we balance the convenience and possibilities of digital technologies with the need to preserve space for reflection, genuine choice, and direct human connection? How can we educate future generations not only to use technologies, but to understand how they are being used by them? How can we design our homes, cities, schools, and institutions in ways that promote conscious engagement with technology instead of unreflective dependence? These practical questions are inseparable from deeper philosophical questions about the nature of individuality, identity, and freedom in the digital age. A crucial point to consider is that although technology is fundamentally transforming our experience of individuality, it is not simply making us less individual in some absolute sense. Instead, it is creating new forms of individuality and collectivity simultaneously. On one hand, we have never had so many opportunities for personalized expression, access to diverse information, and connection with others who share specific interests. On the other hand, this personalization often occurs within systems that standardize, categorize, and influence our behavior in unprecedented ways. The irony is that the more digital platforms promise personalization, the more they can paradoxically make us predictable and manipulable. Algorithmic personalization is not the same as genuine self-determination. It often locks us into feedback loops that reinforce existing patterns instead of truly expanding our horizons. This is one of the central paradoxes of digital life. The same technology that seems to offer unlimited possibilities for individual expression also creates new forms of conformity, predictability, and control. We must also recognize that we are only at the beginning of this transformation. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, brain-machine interfaces, biotechnology, and other emerging technologies will continue to fundamentally reshape our experience of being individuals in the coming years and decades. Each of these technologies brings exciting possibilities and profound risks. Brain-machine interfaces, for example, could allow new forms of communication, creativity, and cognitive expansion, but they also raise unsettling questions about the nature of mental privacy and the potential for direct manipulation of subjective experience. Similarly, advances in biotechnology may offer unprecedented possibilities for modifying and enhancing the human body, but they also challenge traditional notions of natural identity and raise questions about equity, consent, and the meaning of human nature. The philosopher Nick Bostrom has characterized these developments as potentially leading to an explosion of value where the range of possible experiences and ways of being would expand dramatically. But this explosion could also lead to the loss of values we consider fundamental to human experience if we do not carefully navigate these transitions. A crucial question is who will have a voice in the decisions that will shape these developments. Currently, many of the most consequential choices about how digital technologies are designed and implemented are made by a small number of technology companies, often with little public oversight or democratic participation. This raises serious questions about power, responsibility, and justice. Who benefits from these transformations? Who bears the costs? Who is excluded from the conversations that determine our shared future? To wisely navigate these issues, we need not only new technologies and regulations, but also new ways of imagining possibilities. We need new narratives, metaphors, and conceptual models that can help us understand what is happening to us and guide our individual and collective choices. The conceptual frameworks we inherited from liberal humanism, centered on the autonomous and rational individual, are no longer adequate to understand our emerging reality. This does not mean we should abandon the values underlying these frameworks, such as human dignity, freedom, and moral responsibility. It means we need to reimagine what these values mean and how they can be realized in a radically transformed world. For example, the concept of relational autonomy, developed by feminist philosophers such as Catriona Mackenzie and Natalie Stoljar, may offer a promising path. This approach recognizes that autonomy is not the absence of social influence, but the ability to negotiate relationships, critically reflect on external influences, and participate in shaping the social conditions that shape our existence. Instead of seeing autonomy as independence from relationships, this perspective understands it as flourishing within appropriate relationships. Similarly, the concept of contextual privacy, developed by Helen Nissenbaum, offers a more refined way of thinking about privacy in a digital world. Instead of conceiving privacy as simple control over personal information, an increasingly unsustainable view, Nissenbaum understands it as respect for contextually appropriate norms of information flow. This approach recognizes that we share information in different contexts with different expectations and norms, and suggests that privacy is violated when these contextual norms are broken. Another area where we need to develop new conceptual models is our understanding of the relationship between humans and technological systems. We need to go beyond the simple dichotomy between controlling technology or being controlled by it toward a more sophisticated understanding of how we are co-evolving with our technological environments. Philosopher Andy Clark suggests that human beings are natural cyborgs, organisms that have always extended their capacities through tools and technologies. In this view, the question is not whether we should integrate technology into our lives and identities, which we have been doing since the invention of language, but how to do it in ways that genuinely expand our abilities and respect our dignity. In developing new conceptual frameworks, we also need to be attentive to the diversity of human experiences and cultural traditions. Different societies and cultures have varied conceptions of personhood, identity, and the relationship between individual and community. Many non-Western traditions, for example, have more relational and less individualistic views of the self than the Western liberal tradition. These diverse perspectives can offer valuable resources for reimagining what it means to be a person in the emerging digital world. This work of reimagining is not only an intellectual task, but also an artistic, political, and deeply personal one. We need new types of art that can express and explore the experience of individuality in transformation. We need new political arrangements that can protect fundamental human values in the context of increasingly powerful technologies. And each of us needs, in our daily life, to find forms of conscious engagement with technology that preserve space for reflection, genuine choice, and direct human connection. What are the everyday practices, the small resistances and adaptations that can help us preserve a sense of agency and purpose in an algorithmic world? How can we use technology in ways that expand our capacities without compromising our autonomy? How can we create spaces, both digital and physical, that promote forms of interaction that respect our dignity and complexity as human beings? These are questions that all of us face, and there are no definitive answers or universal solutions. What works for one person may not work for another. What is liberating in one context may be oppressive in another, but the very act of asking these questions, of consciously reflecting on our relationship with technology, is an important step toward preserving some form of agency in a rapidly changing world. This work of reflection and adaptation is not something we do once and finish. It is an ongoing process that will require sustained attention, creativity, and commitment as technologies continue to evolve and reshape our lives in ways we can barely imagine now. What is at stake is not only how we use technology, but what kind of beings we will become through our engagement with it. If, as McLuhan famously observed, we first shape our tools and then our tools shape us, we are at a moment where we need to consciously decide what kind of shaping we will allow. This requires not only appropriate regulation and ethical technological design, but also a culture of critical and reflective engagement with technology. This engagement is not only for experts or philosophers, but for all of us who live increasingly in digitally mediated environments. A fundamental part of this engagement is recognizing that we are not alone in our struggles to navigate this new territory. Even though we often experience the challenges of digital life as purely individual problems, they are actually collective issues that require shared conversations, connections, and actions. When we struggle with screen addiction, social media anxiety, or information overload, we are not dealing with mere personal failures of self-control, but responding to environments consciously designed to capture and retain our attention. Recognizing the systemic dimension of these challenges can help us overcome shame and isolation and seek collective solutions beyond individual adaptations. We also need to recognize that our sense of identity and individuality is shaped not only by technology, but by many other factors, including personal relationships, bodily practices, physical communities, and cultural traditions. Although digital technology is becoming increasingly dominant in our lives, it is not the only force shaping who we are. We can consciously cultivate and strengthen these other dimensions of our experience as a counterpoint to the algorithmic logic that permeates so much of contemporary life. This is not a nostalgic call to return to some imagined pre-digital age, but a recognition that being human has always involved multiple dimensions of experience, and that we can consciously work to preserve this multiplicity even as we embrace the possibilities of new technologies. At the same time, we need to be realistic about the transformative power of digital technologies. We are not simply using neutral tools that we can pick up or put down at will. We are inhabiting environments that fundamentally shape how we think, feel, and relate to one another. As more aspects of our lives are digitally mediated, from education and work to love and leisure, the possibilities for non-algorithmic forms of experience become increasingly limited. In this context, the ability to consciously engage with technology, to understand how it is affecting us, and to make informed choices about our use becomes an essential life skill as fundamental as literacy or arithmetic. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose.
Are you positive, are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic for our future? I know it's a hard question
I try to be a realist. I mean, basically optimism is like saying, oh, everything will be okay. And pessimism, no, we are all doomed. Both these positions, they make us abdicate responsibility. If in the end everything will be okay, why bother? You don't need to take action. And it's the same if we are doomed, so why waste whatever little time we have on taking action? Realism is understanding that we have, as human beings, as a human species, we still have the resources, the technology, the wisdom to deal with major challenges, whether it's climate change or whether it's the rise of AI.
One of the things I liked about Buddhism is that belief, to some extent, is of course important. If you don't believe that going to a meditation retreat will help you in some way, you won't go there. But the belief in itself doesn't do anything for you. It's your ability to actually observe the reality without reaction, without judgment, to just see things as they are. This is what liberates.
You don't have children. Is part of the reason you don't have children because you are fearful for the future?
No, it's not a conscious decision. I just never really thought about it. It's not
That's
something
so refreshing to hear.
It's just, sometimes I tell people it's the same way I don't have an elephant. I just never thought about it.
I love that. I've never had that response. I'm someone who doesn't have children, and that's just such a wonderful thing to hear. Thank you, Yuval.